And distinctly not her Undertale costume. Here you go, she's all yours, folks.
How wonderful! The family's all together again. Now you can all finally... What the fuck?
What? What?
Oh shit!
What the heck?
What is this thing?
It's the night! The Warg Knight appeared! Holy shit!
Alright, this is a good time.
The what? Alright, shit, well, it is the night.
The roaring knight appeared!
Due to how good Chapter 4 of Deltarune is often considered to be, I think we often forget about one of the best moments in Deltarune's third chapter, the reveal of the night. On the day of Deltarune coming out, most people only played Chapter 3 due to the long length of both chapters. When I first played Chapter 3, I loved it. I loved the gameplay from the minigames, I loved Tenna, I loved seeing more of our cast grow, and I loved the general step up in visual quality. But what I especially loved from Chapter 3 was the ending reveal of the night, and everyone seemed to agree with me. All I saw on Twitter the day of Deltarune coming out were people losing their minds over the night and how Toby Fox had somehow, against all odds, destroyed pretty much every theory and expectation for what Chapter 3 would end up being. Now this reaction was obviously due to a lot of other crazy moments in Chapter 3, like Tenna being a 3D model, the Undyne reveal, the bunker reveal, it seeming like Tenna died. There was a lot to take in, and while all these twists were shocking, I still think the best and most unexpected twist was easily the night reveal due to its general execution and the community's build-up. In my initial review for Deltarune, I talked more about the general ending for Chapter 3 over the night reveal itself, but as time has gone on, this moment still stands out to me as one of the best moments in Deltarune. I still think about how perfectly the pieces lined up for this moment, how the community's theories itself enhanced this scene significantly. I can guarantee people who will play Chapters 3 and 4 now and in the future will not have anywhere near as intense of a reaction as the Deltarune fans who had been a part of the community for years witnessing this for the first time. While I am a bigger fan of Chapters 2 and 4 and admittedly only became a follower of Deltarune after Chapter 2's release, out of every topic to cover in Deltarune, I think this was the most interesting. This video is going to answer the question, how did the night reveal have such an impact? Or more importantly, how did Deltarune subvert our expectations? Let's start by generally analyzing the night reveal scene, since this is what Toby had in mind initially. The setup for this is directly after the Tenna fight, which is what most people assume is the last boss in Chapter 3. We end the Tenna fight on a grand finale, shooting him with our hearts. While Tenna malfunctions, the entire game show falls apart as we see Tenna glitch in a very similar fashion to Spamton. Afterwards, Tenna breaks down, explaining how he's out of date and irrelevant, that he needed to do this in order to become popular again. Rouse, in a similar fashion to Chapter 1 and 2, attempts to give the big moral lesson to Tenna. However, since he's also kind of out of whack, he says some pretty unintentionally cruel things about how since Tenna's a Darkner, he has to accept that eventually Lightners will forget about him. Rouse is trying to help Tenna in his own way, but he's also trying to affirm what he's been saying since the start of Chapter 3. Before Tenna gives into Rouse's words, Susie steps in to tell Tenna a different story to explain her perspective. Susie talks about how she's always struggled to find new friends, and that the Dark Road has given her those things. Just like Rouse, this story has a double meaning. She's of course trying to comfort Tenna, but is also trying to prove Rouse's mindset wrong. How the experience the Dark Road has given her can't make her possibly forget the Darkners. Tenna explodes with joy once hearing that Susie and Chris will help him find a new owner. Obviously, this isn't enough time for Tenna to be fully done with his arc, but it shows that Tenna still has room to improve, in a similar way to Queen in Chapter 2. This entire scene ends on a nice note, with Tenna being ecstatic and Susie telling Rouse that he won't be forgotten. This scene pretty neatly wraps up a lot of arcs in Chapter 3. Rouse and Susie make up, and Tenna is redeemed. For me though, when I first played Chapter 3, I always felt something was off. If the chapter had ended here, I honestly would have been a little disappointed. I felt like from a writer's perspective, something bigger must happen here to really justify this chapter existing, kind of like the Roin reveal at the end of Chapter 2. Regardless, I brushed it off and continued going through the next scene. That feeling of dread quickly came back within the next scene. Hall of Fame, the song that plays during this scene, is a very obvious remix of a Real Boy from the ending scene for the Spamton Neo boss, and we all know how that fight ends. Maybe I was just a little obsessed with the music of Deltarune, but when I first played this chapter, I felt like something bad was gonna happen. That last line Tenna has where his dialogue slows down was the real final nail in the coffin that confirms something terrible was afoot. Still, despite that unease, I was really surprised to see Tenna die. Of course, as we'll see later, it's possible for Tenna to survive if you recruit everyone, but here I genuinely thought thought he was dead. Tenna's death works perfectly as a total tonal shift. A lot of chapter 3 acts like a game show to distract us and the characters from reality. Even during that arc end scene I just pointed out, we're still viewing it under the lens of a game show, with Tenna still having this very excited game show-esque personality. Tenna's death here is retroactively making the game show aesthetic disappear, since he's the main person pushing that tone. Plus, Tenna's death in general is just so shocking and brutal, and it very naturally works as an absolute extreme that completely flips the tone. After Tenna's death, we pan over to the night, which is done perfectly. The great ambience track that plays, the entire screen darkening, the fact that the night hovers over the dark fountain, all of the detail during this short pan works perfectly to reveal the night. Plus, the night's design in general is just so unique and brilliant. So many darkeners are colorful and wacky, so having the night just be an all black makes them stand out instantly. The night throughout this scene and its boss fight is constantly changing forms, so having them change faces during their introduction scene establishes that concept super well. I also love how they look like a ferocious beast before quickly standing up like a regular person and snatching Toriel, instantly establishing their intelligence. After failing to take Toriel, they run off and the fun gang chases them down. The knight then screams, functioning as a great way to show off the knight's design and establish their twisting forms. Then we get the sickest animation ever of them swinging their bat into a sword, beginning the fight. Now for this entire opening cutscene, I wasn't really sure who this was. For a bit I thought it could have been Mike or a new character. The scene is so short and overwhelming that you don't have a lot of time to think about it. That's why the use of Black Knife's intro and the opening text, "The Roaring Knight appeared," still hits like a truck. So many reactions I've seen to this fight were never really sure what was happening until that text appeared, which is just perfect execution. It's one of the rawest lines in the game, and that combination of text with Black Knife makes for a perfect reveal. I'm gonna cover the fight, but not the full thing, since if you're not doing the secret route, you'll probably die in the first couple attacks. Black Knife is a great song, as I said in my song ranking. The second half isn't as good as its first, but wow, that first half is a perfect introduction. The Burn and Despair leitmotif is the perfect way to introduce the knight, just this super intense, chaotic bass. The first attack, while actually very easy in hindsight, looks impossible when you first play it due to how many projectiles are flying on screen. Plus, usually if you don't save before the fight, you'll be on low health thanks to Tenna, which usually results in you dying on the first attack. After losing against the knight, we continue with chapter 3, but there's still a little more I want to talk about. The knight twist actually ripples out into other twists. For example, the name of chapter 3, Late Night, actually stands for the night being late. Additionally, Tenna's smile turns into the night after you beat the chapter. Rousey's arc in chapter 4 also shows that during chapter 3, he wasn't fully convinced by Susie's argument. In fact, he was definitely pretending. It really shows how hollow and pointless that ending note was, which is great because I always felt there was something off about it. The night itself isn't just a twist, it changes the entire tone too, whether that be chapter 3's ending or chapter 4's tone in general. Anyways, I've rambled a lot over a 3-minute scene, but in retrospect, is this fight really that good? The idea of an unwinnable fight to introduce a villain isn't all that unique to Deltarune. The scene itself is still great, but how did it have such an impact to make it stand out among all the other incredible moments in Deltarune? Before we get into the community's buildup of the night, let's just go over what we knew about the night in chapters 1 and 2. The night's presence is felt very early on from the very first interaction Susie and Chris have with the Dark Road. When entering the closet in chapter 1, someone closes the door on them. It's an often overlooked detail, and while not confirmed yet, this is almost definitely the night closing the door. It's also heavily implied this Dark Road was created by the night, or at the very least they had a hand in creating it. Throughout chapter 1, the night is brought up vaguely by characters who have been around for a very long time. King, Jevil, and Sean. Of course, there is one mention of the night from the Diamond King, but that guy doesn't do anything, so we're not going to talk about him. Off King, Jevil, and Sean's dialogue, we can put together what the night did to the card castle. On a first playthrough, the only mention of the night is through King and Sean. Sean mentions that for a long time, card castle was balanced, even after the Lightners left the Darkners. However, that balance was changed when the night appeared. It put the Spade King into power and threw the Dark Road off balance. This dialogue is later confirmed by King, who discusses the night during his battle. Since the night had brought life back into the kingdom, King believes that the night wishes the worst upon the Lightners and chooses to follow its orders. The knight obviously wants to cause the roaring, so we can assume that this is what King was trying to do in chapter 1. In chapter 4, we actually get confirmation that King had no idea what he was doing and was just being manipulated by the knight, which is a common thing the knight does in later chapters. The last person to mention the knight is Jevil. Jevil, being a secret boss, knows a lot about the future, and when fighting him, he'll mention how the knight will arrive soon before dipping out. That's pretty much all we knew of the knight in chapter 1. They appeared one day and threw everything out of balance. This is the main reason why knight speculation wasn't massive during the time time of Chapter 1, because not many people cared enough, since we barely knew anything about them. We didn't even know if they were going to appear again since everyone was so focused on that Chris reveal. Chapter 2 is where the Knight discourse became much more prevalent. The Knight's first action in Chapter 2 is creating another Dark Fountain. In Chapter 1 it's debatable if Chris created the Dark Fountain or not, but this time it absolutely can't be them. Most people agreed that off context clues, the Knight hid inside the closet and created the Dark Fountain while Noelle and Birdley were studying, making it impossible for Chris to do it since we follow Chris during that entire sequence of events. The Knight is mentioned once by Sweep Capping Cakes, but this is early in the game, so you quickly forget about it. The next time we get to hear about the Knight is way later in the game in Queen's Mansion. There's a room in Queen's Mansion of the Swatchling studying the creation of a Dark Fountain based on the Knight's actions, pretty much confirming the Knight created the Chapter 2 fountain. The next and easily most important Knight mention is what Queen tells us before the Giga Queen fight. She explains how the Knight, now dubbed the Roaring Knight, created the Dark Fountains and brought joy to the Dark Road. Because of this, she wants to create another Dark Fountain to cause the roaring and cover the world in darkness, believing it'll make the Lightners happy. However, she calls out that the Knight has already left, so she chooses to attempt to make one of the other Lightners create another Dark Fountain. Off this info, we can see that the Knight 1 created the Chapter 2 Dark Fountain, or both of them, and 2 that they are a Lightner. Later on it's revealed Queen was just mimicking the Knight's actions, showcasing the ever-present theme of the Knight manipulating the main villains of each chapter. Susie mentions the Knight during the end of the chapter, how despite making these Dark Fountains it's become more of a positive thing. This is more important to Susie than the Knight, but it's another mention of it, to plant that seed in your mind. The last mention we get of the Knight is of course Spamton. Continuing the trend of secret bosses hinting at the future, in Spamton's shop he mentions Mike and the Roaring Knight. His mention of the Knight is very brief. He tries to talk about the Knight but starts bugging out, implying the Knight is some form of higher power, potentially influencing him. Later, Chapter 2 ends on the cliffhanger that Chris is the Knight, as they create another Dark Fountain. This is of course untrue, but it became a present theory at the time, and for most people, myself included, believed this. Anyways, that's everything we knew about the Knight through chapters 1 and 2. As the years went by for chapters 3 and 4, the community's consensus on who the Knight was grew and grew, leading to several theories. Obviously, the first theory people were gonna latch on to was the Chris Knight theory, which was easily the most common theory after Chapter 2's release. Personally, I was never a massive subscriber to this one. I thought it was true when I first played the chapter, but as time has gone on, it grew off me a lot. Despite this, there's still a bit to cover here. This theory obviously became super popular because of the Chapter 2 ending twist. Narratively, a lot of people disliked the idea of the Knight being a faceless antagonist and felt that Chris being the main villain of Deltarune was significantly more interesting. Besides the ending for Chapter 2, there was one other piece of evidence for the Chris Knight theory. A lot of people believed Chris created the Chapter 1 Dark Fountain since when first saving, Chris already had a save point there. There was one major point against the Chris Knight theory. As said before, it's often believed the Knight had to create the Chapter 2 Dark Fountain while Noelle and Birdley were inside the computer lab, making it impossible for Chris to create it. However, a lot of Chris Knight truthers argued that the Dark Road could have already been created, and that Noelle and Birdley fell into it in a similar way to Chris and Susie in Chapter 1. The main reason why people believed in Chris Knight was its lack of counter-evidence. There wasn't much to debunk this theory besides Toby's style of writing and vibes. On the other hand though, there really wasn't a lot of evidence for this theory besides the Chapter 2 ending cutscene. Chris Knight was by far the least interesting theory to come out of this time period. It's very surface level, and due to this, several new Knight theories began to emerge in popularity, like Alvin Knight. After Chris' theory was widely debunked, people began to look into other potential Lightners, leading into the Alvin Knight theory. Father Alvin is a minor character in Deltarune that up until Chapter 2 had only appeared twice in the entire game. He's the father of the church, at the time an unexplored area in Deltarune. For a while most people didn't talk about Alvin, but after Chapter 2 he was put under significant speculation because of one line of dialogue he had in Chapter 2. When talking to Alvin in the graveyard and leaving, you can overhear him talking to Gerson, asking if it would be okay for him to take his hammer and do something. This led to a whole ray of suspicion that led into Alvin Knight theory. Besides this one obvious line, there was a lot of evidence to back up this theory. For one, Alvin is a major part of the church, a place that worships the angel. As the legend states in Chapter 1, the three heroes must eventually come together to banish the angel's heaven. While we still don't fully know what the angel or its heaven is, the goals of the three heroes goes against the church, and since the Knight is the main villain of Deltarune, this makes Alvin a likely antagonist. A lot of people connected Alvin to Gerson's dialogue in Undertale. If you didn't know, Gerson is one of the only characters in Undertale to acknowledge and be aware of the player. Because of this knowledge, it's possible that Alvin could also be aware of the player, or the game itself, making him again a pretty good candidate for an antagonist. Speaking of Gerson, Alvin is one of the only original characters in Deltarune that tie into Undertale, being a new character that is the son of an Undertale character. This piece of evidence was used to support this theory by asking, why would Toby introduce this side character if not for a deeper reason? Lastly, Spamton's dialogue around the night in chapter 2 states, speaking of communion. Communion is a sacred Christian ritual involving the symbolic consumption of bread and wine, which ties pretty strictly into the church. That's most of the loose evidence surrounding Alvin, but there was also a lot of speculation around the main piece of evidence for this theory, Alvin's dialogue at the graveyard. The first thing people speculated on was why Alvin was taking Gerson's hammer. The most common explanation was that Alvin took Gerson's hammer to make the dark fountains. This didn't fully fit since you need a sharp object to create a dark fountain, but the hammer could still work. Alvin also had connections to the chapter 1 dark road since the old closet has a drawing of Gerson that Alvin drew when he was a child. Lastly, the chapter 1 and chapter 2 dark fountains both had connections to Alvin. Gerson was a teacher in the school and Miss Boom worked in the library. Alvin had easy connections to both places. For most people, including me, I hard subscribe to the Alvin Knight theory. Out of all the popular theories, this one had the most evidence, and it also probably had the smallest amount of speculation involved. However, this theory still had some major issues, more specifically how unimportant Alvin is. He's completely irrelevant, getting only maybe 15 lines of dialogue in the entire game. He doesn't even get a dialogue sprite, and some really random characters get those. The main counterpoint to this argument was that when we would eventually find Alvin in the Dark Road, he would get his sprite, but that was just speculation. Anyways, Alvin Knight was one of the most popular theories that held out until chapter 3 and 4's release, but people kept digging. Back in the chapter 1 era of Deltarune, no one knew much about the Knight. Due to this lack of information, the biggest and most popular contender was Gaster. Despite how desperate it sounds, this theory did have some interesting connections. For one, in the egg room, something pretty strictly tied to Gaster, the man behind the tree gives you an egg. Egg translated over into wingdings translates into left, up, up, the movement of a knight in chess. Just a side note, this has to be one of the coolest details in Deltarune. I feel like there's a very good chance this is unintentional, but if Gaster is somehow the knight, this would be a crazy detail. For more evidence, the knight's hand is mentioned a few times, and Gaster is obviously the man who speaks in hands. There is also some evidence for Gaster Knight off the scraps of chapter 1, but due to how little chapter 1 has to offer, the theory slowly died out until chapter 2. Once chapter 2 came out and everyone was past Chris Knight, Gaster Knight began to reappear in the Knight discussion. Queen's monologue gave us a much better look into how the Dark Roads work, and this monologue ties into entry 17 extremely well to the point where it's pretty widely accepted entry 17 is about dark fountains. Gaster's knowledge of dark fountains makes him extremely unique since most characters definitely don't. Spamton in chapter 2 also gave us a lot of connections to Gaster being the knight. At the end of the Spamton fight in chapter 2, we can talk to the Addisons who explain his whole deal. At the end of it, we get the reveal that when the mystery man left Spamton, all the Addisons heard on the phone was garbage noise. This garbage noise can be connected back to entry 17, since the sound effect played during it is also called garbage noise. Anyways, based off this dialogue, it's often accepted that Gaster was the one on the phone with Spamton. Plus, Gaster's mysterious abilities explains how he could get Spamton to stop speaking about the knight. Spamton's significant role in chapter 2 led a lot of theories back to Jevo around chapter 1. He was also a character driven mad by a mysterious person, who Sean described as turning Jevo's viewpoint on the world darker yet darker. Additionally, both Jevo and Spamton seem to know who the knight is. Jevo's dialogue about the knight hints at this, and Spamton tries to talk about the knight, which seems to imply he's directly telling Chris who it is. This running theme of Gaster turning secret bosses crazy and these secret bosses seeming to know who the knight is added a lot to this theory. Gaster Knight was liked, but also very much hated. A lot of people saw the evidence but prayed the knight wouldn't be Gaster, and I was kind of on the same boat. I can kind of see Gaster being the knight, but the knight and Gaster are both so interesting that having them both be the same person feels really lame. The idea of two higher powers in Deltarune worked a lot better in my mind. As the wait for chapters 3 and 4 continued, a lot more out there theories began to drop, like multi-knight or the Seven Knights theory. This theory was dubbed by Cammy Boy G, leading to several more interpretations of his blueprint. Multi-knight or the Seven Knights theory was a theory that believed that more than one character created the Dark Fountains. Multi-Knight specifically being 2 or 3 characters, and Seven Knights believing that a new knight would create a new Dark Fountain for each chapter. Some evidence for this is that the name The Roaring Knight only appears in chapter 2 and was never mentioned in chapter 1. Taking this idea, you can assume that the chapter 1 knight and chapter 2 knight are both 2 different characters, and that the chapter 3 knight is Chris. The term knight is often loosely thrown around throughout the game too. For example, in the chapter 2 Snowgrave route, Queen asks Susie and Chris which one of them wants to be the new knight, implying that the name of knight can be transferred over. over. The original theory from Kamiboy G predicted that Alvin, Miss Boom, and Chris filled the roles of the first 3 knights, and that past chapter 3 it was more of a free-for-all. After this theory dropped, most of the community swapped around who the Strange Knight, Roaring Knight, and Future Knights could be. Past this point, we're getting into 2023 to early 2025 Deltarune territory, and if you were there, you know we're approaching by far the most chaotic period of Deltarune's community. The longer you spend in this community, the deeper things begin to get, causing some insane theories to emerge. Some of these theories came out before 2025, but the spread of Deltarune and the continued desperate need for new content led to some absolutely crack theories on who the knight could be. There are a lot of these theories, so I'll just speedrun through some of the best. For example, Papyrus Knight, a sorta jokey theory made around the original theory that Papyrus was the Eggman, which became a giant inside joke inside the Deltarune community. Knife Knight, the theory that Chris's knife was the Roaring Knight, since technically the knife stabbed the earth, making it the one to create the Chapter 3 Dark Fountain. A ton of theories from Jar Jaro's Knight video is a good example of the potential for the knight being every single character in the game, not limited to Mad Mew Mew Knight, Chara Knight, Rules Card Knight, Asgore Knight, Caddy Knight, Metaton Knight, and yeah, I think we're gonna stop there. Those were most of the big theories I wanted to cover, but I also have to explain how the community warped this character and mystery. There was a long gap between chapters 2 and 3, and since we didn't know a lot about the knight, the community speculated and came up with some crazy stuff. For the most part, everyone saw the knight as this villain pulling the strings in a similar sense to Gaster, a character we probably won't see until the end of Deltarune. I personally believed this for a while, that based on how chapters 1 and 2 handled the knight, we would continue to see the knight be built up in future chapters, and once they would eventually appear, we would additionally get the twist of who they were. Anyways, being in the community for this long is what eventually led the knight scene to destroy mine and plenty of other people's expectations. So I've just gone through and set up most of the popular Deltarune theories during the post-Chapter 2 era, and now it's time to knock down all that setup and cover how the knight reveal pretty much destroyed all of them. Obviously, some people assumed the knight would appear earlier, but for me and most people, this seemed like such an impossible situation. I think it's because the knight was treated as this ongoing mystery for years, and most people began to see it as a mystery that would slowly be unveiled throughout the course of Deltarune, especially since most theories operated under the common assumption that the knight would act as a twist villain. The knight throughout chapters 1 and 2 would only appear in very small details, often being communicated through small dialogue interactions. The build-up for the knight was extremely subtle, and I think that most people assumed that these clues would slowly become more and more present before everything would hit its climax with a big reveal. However, the knight scene took these small moments of build-up and took it all the way up to 100. Honestly, this situation felt so impossible, but looking back on it with some hindsight, this was a pretty likely possibility. Most knight theories did boil down to assumptions and lots of speculation, and I don't think people really accounted for that. I've detailed the knight scene itself already, so I'll skip around that element, but the general execution of it is definitely why the twist destroyed so many expectations. The weight of the knight reveal felt like the kind of reveal you would expect to happen at the end of Deltarune. Chapter 1 and 2 have their intense moments, but they generally feel low in stakes, and taking those vibes into consideration, something this intense happening in the normal route of Deltarune only felt possible in the late game. Honestly, this assumption made me and a lot of people believe the knight showing up early would feel lame and underdeveloped, but that lack of development doesn't matter when Deltarune is able to pull this reveal off so perfectly, as I've already discussed. Besides Snowgrave, this was easily the most serious moment in Deltarune, up until chapter 4 that is, but we're not gonna get into that. Still though, with Snowgrave in mind, this scene captures a new form of intensity never seen in Deltarune. After destroying your expectations of the knight that you've had in mind, Deltarune just overloads you with so much new information about this character that we've only gotten breadcrumbs of. The bat, its withered look and its scream, those damn antlers, this moment just throws away any chance for so many popular theories to ever happen. Chris Knight is obviously impossible, Alvin Knight doesn't make any sense now, Multi Knight is holding on by a loose thread. This scene, and especially those damn antlers, destroyed everything that had been built up over the last 3 years. The Knight reveal basically sent the community back to square one, throwing us completely off. And so that's how Deltarune completely shattered and destroyed our expectations. Wait. Did I get sidetracked? Wasn't I supposed to talk about subverting expectations? Well, to do that, we're gonna have to get into So some of you may be wondering why this video is even called How Deltarune Subverted Our Expectations, because when you look at it, Deltarune really destroyed them. Everything we thought was going to happen with the knight was completely destroyed in that reveal, and only a few small possibilities in a vast sea ended up being true. Like, how did a community this talented and skilled fumble this hard? The reason is that we were actually right, just not in the way we expected. Chris Knight, as I said in the last segment, was pretty quickly debunked in chapter 3 before the night scene even happened. However, in chapter 4, we got way more info on Chris through the Noel House segment, and now it's almost 100% canon that they're working for the Knight, meaning them creating the Dark Fountain in chapter 3 was technically the Knight's will. It's still up in the air if Chris's job in the Knight's plot was to make all the Dark Fountains, but it's still very much possible that the chapter 1, 2, and 4 fountains were created by them off screen. Okay, the chapter 4 Dark Fountain is pushing it, but it's still possible. The biggest piece of evidence for Chris Knight theory is the scene that follows the gang defeating the Knight. After swooning Susie and Rousey, they make Chris kneel down to them, which seems pretty counteractive until you realize they're literally knighting Chris, making Chris a second knight. So I mean, technically Chris is a knight, maybe not the Roaring Knight, but they're a knight. So yeah, Chris Knight did end up being true, just in a slightly different way. Now, Alvin Knight feels like a theory that isn't possible anymore. For a while after playing chapter 4, I assumed he would be a bigger focus in future chapters, maybe getting a little bit of a character arc after reading the letters Susie wrote for him. However, when you really think about it, why did Alvin even take Gerson's hammer? He's still a very suspicious character. He tells Chris to avoid the bunker. He's one of the hometown residents to own a bunker code along with Mayor Holiday, one of the most obvious villains in the game. It's very likely that just like Chris, he's working with the Knight in some way, his motivation possibly being to revive Gerson or one of the other reasons I listed before. Additionally, you could also read him taking the hammer as an act to continue the prophecy, since Gerson being in the Dark Road is the only reason why the Roaring didn't happen in chapter 4. This one is a lot more open-ended, but just like Chris Knight, Alvin Knight isn't true anymore, but has been subverted in a different way. Okay, for Gaster Knight, this one isn't true. It's very unlikely for Gaster to be the Knight. I mean, the Knight has Gaster hands, but that's about all we got. However, the new chapters for Deltarune gave us so much more Gaster info. We get to focus on the bunker way more, something clearly tied to Gaster, and there's way more Gaster dialogue we get through the mysterious narrator. I mean, even if you were a Gaster Knight truther, you can't be upset that to balance that, we got the My Deltarune scene, which I feel like makes up for any disappointment. Plus, a lot of people hated Gaster Knight in the first place, and chapter 4 pretty much confirms he's another higher being just like the Knight. In fact, he's probably even higher than the Knight, since the My Deltarune line implies he's the one who created the world and game. And frankly, this interpretation of Gaster is far cooler and interesting than him just being the Knight. Lastly, Multi-Knight. I mean, this one is honestly pretty much true. As I just said, Chris is basically a second Knight, making this theory pretty much correct. Although through the new chapters, the Knight's role has expanded far beyond just creating the Dark Fountains. They now have other ulterior motives that we're slowly learning more of. Now that the reveal of the Knight is out of the way, we're getting new breadcrumbs for those working for them and why. Besides the 4 theories I already covered in this video, there were some other more unpopular Knight theories that ended up being far more true. Death Knight and Carol Knight are the 2 big candidates nowadays, but they existed during the chapter 2 era. In fact, I was a pretty strong believer of Mayor Knight. There really just wasn't any evidence for these 2 characters during the chapter 2 era, and all of it was pretty much speculation, which didn't give me a lot to talk about. Deltarune chapter 4 kinda took these 2 more obscure theories and pushed them way further, focusing on Carol and Des way more. And of course, the last theories I want to discuss are the crack theories, which weren't true at all. Those were actually completely destroyed, like they had any legs to begin with. But who knows, they could still be true in future chapters. We just have to be patient for Papyrus Knight. And that's my video on how Deltarune subverted our expectations. The reveal scene for the Knight destroyed our expectations. It took everything we thought we knew about this character and threw it out the window. But by chapter 4, Toby began building up new mysteries around the Knight, and our previous theories and expectations were subverted by being included in more subtle ways. Man, I just love how Toby Fox writes. I have no idea if any of this was intentional or if it was all just a coincidence, but he took something that could have come across as disappointing and executed it perfectly. The idea of the Knight showing up early just felt weak, but it was done masterfully, and he still had time to take everyone's ideas about the game and pay them off in unique ways, giving us new clues to guide us in a new direction, only to, let's be honest, destroy them all again in chapter 5. I feel like the Knight scene has stuck with me so much because of all these elements behind the game, and I really just wanted to make a video on it. For a while I was thinking about how Deltarune destroyed our expectations, but I thought about it more, and that's how this video was made. If you want a real example of our expectations being destroyed, look at the Titan in chapter 4. I'm not gonna do a whole video on that because of the hard focus on the Knight in the community, but man, that scene hits is just as hard. Anyways, knowing Toby Fox, we are still probably wrong about everything. The night could be as real for all I know. But yeah, thanks for watching my Deltarune video essay. As always, I really thought I had a unique idea with this video, but nah, someone beat it to me again. However, just like last time, I didn't watch it, so hopefully whatever is said in that video isn't copied here. This entire video is my thoughts and research. If you're here from the escapism video, hi, I do other stuff that isn't Deltarune still. I was seriously considering making this the last Deltarune video I do until chapter 5, and I might still do that because I have no more ideas, but who knows. I enjoy making these videos and they seem to do really well, so I'm not sure. I've been working on this all October, so there's a reason why my channel has been dead for a month. There's gonna be a ton of stuff in November and December that I've been working on for a bit, so yeah, enjoy. Thanks for watching, and this is an epic outro. Oh, and yeah, I got permission to use this Black Knife remix, and I wanted to include it here because it's just as good as the Black Knife remix I used at the opening, so here, credits.
Imagine chapter 3 starts and the knight jumps down. He's his own entity. He's literally like a chessboard knight. And he says, "It's me. I'm the knight, not Chris."